Okay, I'm going to show you some water effects now. If we go ahead and load in an infinite plane of water, and as you can see we have our default water loaded in, but if we open up our display timeline under animation, and we render, see there's no change in our surface as we're rendering, and that's because it's not animated water. But there's a really easy way to make it animated, and what we can do is just double click on the water surface, and you can do this with any of the liquids. We could just grab one of these liquids. If we grab the wavy water and click OK, and we're going to select no right now because we don't want to animate it for our surface. And it did that because we weren't at frame 0. So if we move our slider at all and we don't have any keyframes, we can select this button right here and it will bring us to the start at 0. We could also type a number in here. But in order to animate this, we could just click Animate Material Surface, Z equals time. And now if we go ahead and drag this over, and we render, you'll see there is a change in our surface. And what that actually did was make it animated. So that's a really easy way to animate water. There's also some pre-animated surfaces. If I close this out, and we go ahead to our material chooser, we could go to Animated, and we can select waters that are presets already that already animate. And we click OK, and now we can see that new texture in there, and we can go ahead and just move that along. There's another thing too. Water is transparent, so what we have underneath is actually our ground plane. As you can see, we can see kind of that ground color underneath the water, and it shows up because our water is transparent. And this is very important if you're creating islands. If we add a terrain right now, and we go ahead and zoom in, just so we can see the edges right here. And actually this water isn't a very good example of it. I'm going to double click on that water, and actually double click on that surface again. And under liquids, I'm going to select the default water. Click OK. We're going to say no on animated. Click OK. And I'm going to go ahead and rotate our camera around. And actually we've created a little animation here by moving our camera not on the 0. But that's okay, because we're just going to show you this here. And I'm going to double click here, and we can see the level of our water. So we can go ahead and click on this water and actually drag it up a lot higher. And now if we take a look at our water, we can see the transparency underneath it of the actual terrain. And this is important because you don't want to have your terrain not joining up with that ground surface, because if I go ahead and select our terrain and we move it upward, we're going to see, even though it is underwater, we see the seam for the outside of our terrain underneath the water. So you want to make sure that it's with a ground plane, and that way it will blend along with the ground plane. And you also want to make sure too that you have a correct texture set for whatever it is you're animating. You could add a sand texture to the ground and that will show up, and that's kind of just a neat little method for creating sand underneath your water. And what you could also do is do a multi-level material for your terrain, and have it so the sand starts right at the water line, and then that'll go ahead and just blend in with your ground plane, and that's kind of a neat way of making an island. But I'm going to show you another thing now, and that is underwater. If we go ahead and move our camera underneath that water plane, see everything becomes dark, and we have this sort of water casting along our terrain and all of our bottom surfaces. We could also grab our water and move it up a lot higher, and we get more of a better underwater effect here by doing so. There are also presets specifically for this. If we double click on our water texture up here, and then double click on this again, or you could just hit this arrow and pull up the chooser, we do have specific underwater texture right here. And we're going to click OK. And we're going to say no for animated because we're not on the 0. And that's why it's asking us that. But this is specifically for underwater scenes. As you can see, we get a very green looking effect on there. So you can go ahead and add, if you want, on this terrain, kind of a coral texture, and throw an ecosystem of anemones on there, and different types of underwater plant life, and just some neat stuff you can do with it. And also, if we come out of the water, you can see it still looks like water on top. And if we get in there close enough too, we might even be able to see the terrain underneath the water. And we can. So that's another neat way of creating different effects. So if you have an island and you want to create a coral reef underneath it, this is a really good way of doing it. Maybe not with this specific water type, because this is meant specifically for underwater effects, and it's not exactly very good looking aesthetically. So it's just kind of a neat little thing you can do there to create some nice water effects. Also, if you go ahead and rotate the camera underneath the water, and we look up, we can see our sky through the water. And this is a really neat effect if you want to create animated water and show through it. And you get some nice reflections of the sky and things like that through your water. So you can do some really neat effects that way too. And there's one other thing I wanted to show you. If we rotate our camera down, as you can see, our movement changes as we reach lower. And that's because what we're doing is we're hitting the ground plane right now, and our camera stops and doesn't go below it and starts rotating up. Well, you could change that if, for instance, you wanted to go underneath that ground plane. If we go to File Options and we select Stop Camera going below a clipping plane, and we can go ahead and check that off and click OK. And now if we rotate our camera, you can see we're actually going below that ground plane. So it's really to your specific preferences of what it is you're animating, if you want to actually go underneath that ground plane or not, or whether or not you want it to cut off at that point. So if you want to go ahead and change it back, just check it again, click OK. And now we get that stop movement of the camera, and it refuses to go below the ground plane. So that's kind of a neat little feature in there to help you with your modeling and animation and kind of your framing for your camera.